We'd like to welcome you back again. As we approach the end of the year, we thought it would be a good idea to go over some of the segments, the stories that we covered in the news over the past year. But before we start, I'd like to talk about something called the Doomsday Clock, which is an interesting concept. It was actually created in 1947, and it's supposed to demonstrate the greatest danger to the Earth in relation particular to the prospect that the United States and the Soviet Union were headed for a nuclear arms race. In 2007, the clock considered possible catastrophic disruptions from climate change and put them into the equation. And I think it's interesting to say that right now the hands of the clock are just 100 seconds before midnight, which is really less than 2 minutes. Peter, what do we think about the Doomsday Clock? Is it accurate? Are we just 2 minutes before midnight, which is supposed to be the end of the world?
Well, something I think we'll talk about a bit more in depth is also there's the pandemic, which has been quite significant, something that we haven't seen, for a very long time. I don't know how long. It's hard to say about the end of the world because I think that's something that's in God's hands. We know this age will end when Jesus comes back, and so trying to figure out how close we are to the end of our age can be a little fruitless, and also I think can be a little bit sensationalist and put fears in people's minds where we need to be thinking about maybe keeping our minds on more positive things.
Giving a bit more credit to the Doomsday Clock idea. It is decided upon every year by a group of scientists, including 12 Nobel Prize laureates that get together every year, knock their heads together to see how close they think we are to either atomic war or climate catastrophes that could, put an end to the Earth. I think we have some people like Elon Musk that wants to be out of the Earth's atmosphere in some years because he thinks there's maybe more of a chance of him surviving on Mars. That's
a tough place.
That's a tough place. So far, not a very livable space. But I think in light of Bible prophecy, certainly we don't agree with the Doomsday Clock because it seems like the world is getting closer and closer, especially with the creation of the internet. In the past 50 years, we've seen countries in Europe unite, and it seems like the world would want to do its best to try to keep things together and get along, even nation with nation, rather nation against nation. In the Oval Office, there's something called the red button, or the President of the United States has. I know in the old Soviet Union, they also had a similar button. They could press that button and you could have nuclear war. Do we think that any world leader would actually press a button like that to cause atomic war?
I can't imagine anyone at the moment who would be inclined to do that. Do you think so?
So far, except for the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in the early 60s, I think that was the closest time to nuclear war, at least from the reports that we've seen.
It's such an obscene thing to think about. Like I can't imagine anyone who would actually make that choice, but yet we have spent hundreds of billions of dollars constructing a system to do exactly that.
Yeah, incredible. We'd like to reference, because in the Bible, in prophecy in the Bible, and we're just going to read two short excerpts here, one from the book of Revelation and one from the book of Daniel. It certainly doesn't look like the world is going to blow itself up, although there will be lots of problems. Instead, it looks like the world will be coming to one world government headed by what we would call the Antichrist. It says in Revelation chapter 13, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard." And then we'll drop down to verse 6. It says, "He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name," God's name, "and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven." So this is a pretty bad guy, and it says in verse 8, Revelation 13:8, "And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And then if we go on to Daniel chapter 11, it says, he shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and presumably this is talking about the same person. And it says, and the king shall do according to his will, in verse Daniel 11:36, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. So it seems like rather than the world blowing itself up, we're going to get someone that will pull the world together. And I think a lot of people might be happy to hear that somebody is going to come along and unite the world, especially since the world seems to have so many problems. A lot of people are going to be happy to have one Papa, Padre, Father, bring us all together.
Sure, yeah. Then there is the idea also that perhaps what we consider our current civilization will suffer some significant catastrophes that would enable this character to pull people together and take power, no?
Yes, and I think if you look at the economics of the world today, it certainly seems that the world has marched toward one world economy. I mean, one nation's economy is so affected by another. Look at the United States and China and Europe, and it seems like there's a gathering together of economies that want to work together. And then you have, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Certainly some people don't want to see that happen. Some people don't want to see one world government. But I think there's a big segment in the world that would welcome that.
Yeah, or there's disagreement over who would rule that one world government. You know,
somebody we all love. Somebody, except if your name's written in the Lamb's book of life, as it says in the book of Revelation.
Right, right. Getting into some of the big stories from this past year that we're coming to the end of right now. Of course, we had in the United States, there was a change of administration. And something funny happened at about the time of the changeover, January 6th, which is when we like to celebrate Epiphany. And I guess some people get a little carried away. And there was in the U.S. something that hadn't happened before, where one faction tried to, by force, storm the Capitol building and disrupt the changeover of power. What do you think about that? That was something pretty significant, no?
We've never seen it happen in our lifetime, and it didn't even happen in the Civil War time in 1860 when the Civil War broke out in the United States. It's interesting because I think from the news reports that we've seen and even the stuff that you read on the internet, the people that showed up at the Capitol on that day were presumably supporting President Trump, and they didn't want to see him go. And the election results, whether you say they were right or whether they were wrong, put Biden into power, and they didn't want to see that happen. So a lot of the people that showed up in the Capitol, Washington, D.C., they were conservative. They belonged to the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, the majority of which said they were Republicans or independents. And many of those conservatives called themselves Christians or claimed to be Christian, and I don't doubt that they were. But do you think that was the Christian thing to do? Is that the way Christians should behave themselves? And to be fair, a lot of the people that went to Washington, D.C. didn't really partake in the climbing up the steps, but there were some hundreds of people that did that.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me, I guess, of what Paul says. Paul addresses the church to abstain from that kind of behavior. I think we saw just kind of, in a lot of these cases, it was like an internet addiction gone to an extreme end, where a lot of these people, they had some fantasies in their head, and they thought that they were, living out, they thought they were carrying out some kind of epic maneuver. They were taking part in some big thing that was happening, and a lot of these guys now have had to go before judges, and they're crying and apologizing.
They're getting prison
sentences. It's just, and to think that Christians can get into this kind of stuff it's a sobering warning about, maybe the importance of kind of keeping back from the world and
Right.
putting our focus on things that are above.
But I think it's important to remember the last thing that Jesus told his disciples to do, and that was not to overthrow the Roman Empire, but it was to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And I think as Christians, that's what we need to remember, that that's our main job, to spread the gospel, to tell people about Jesus, and to try to bring them to salvation that Jesus gave us, and not to be so involved in the politics of the day. Not to say that some political issues are not important, they are, and we're not minimizing that, but it certainly seemed to have gone over the line, and like, as you mentioned, a lot of frenzy around that January event in the United States. Probably, if you're not here in the United States, you were shocked to see that happen in what is considered one of the great democracies of the world.
Yeah.
And
well, it is a country that has, exported a lot of political instability, and sometimes these things do end up coming home. What we sow, we end up reaping sometimes.
yes. Well, we'd like to go on just a few more minutes about one of the big stories that we were faced with this year, and it is an ongoing story, and that is COVID-19. Now, for the last 2 years, I think people are surprised to see it continuing today, and now we have the third variant, which is called Omicron. There is some reference in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, that the world would be affected by plagues that kill certain populations. And specifically, there are 3 plagues that hit the world. There are some people out there on the internet that say the 3 plagues are the COVID-19 virus, the original virus that came at the end of 2019. Then there was the Delta variant, and now Omicron. Peter, are these the plagues that the book of Revelation is talking about, do you think?
Well, in this this series that we're recording, which hopefully we'll be putting up soon, we talk about these things in Revelation, and when John gets his revelation of the time of the end, this last age before Jesus' second coming, there will be a lot of death from plagues, and it is something that does happen during these last days. Now, as far as the different variants, well, we sure hope this is the last one. 2 years ago, this was still just a local thing in China. It hadn't gone worldwide. And by now, I mean, I doubt, probably most people watching this probably know of someone who has died. It's pretty significant thing that's happened. And I guess I feel like these are things that in our modern world a lot of people haven't had to experience, thankfully. But we do know that there are always trials and tribulations in the world. But we know Jesus, and
Yes.
Jesus keeps us through
That's
these
right.
things.
Now, with the mandates that are being given in different parts of the world, now even in the United States, the city of Chicago and New York are coming down with pretty strong mandates. In some countries, you can't ride public transportation unless you have been vaccinated. I don't know if that means vaccinated once or had the second shot or the booster. And in Israel now, they're on their second booster or their fourth shot. Some people out there on the internet are calling this possibly the mark of the beast. Now, we've discussed this in previous segments that we've had, and the reason we don't feel it's the mark of the beast is, well, it's not a worldwide mandate that you cannot buy or sell unless you have the vaccine. Do we think it could be, there could be any relation to the mark of the beast where you have to have that or you're not able to buy or sell, and the mandates that are being issued?
Well, I think the mark of the beast will be something pretty harmful. It's going to be connected to worship of the beast. We do see, of course, the way governments are able to exercise control, like you said, in some places more than others. It is pretty significant, the kinds of things that people are learning to live with, that we would not have understood or been able to really fathom or accept just a couple of years ago. I mean, things have moved very fast these last couple of years.
I
for sure.
spoke with a friend of mine in Australia last week, and pretty much everybody that he knew was vaccinated. And I don't know how the mandates in Australia are going, but he was surprised when I told him here where we live, because there is such this mentality of freedom in the United States, and specifically here in the state of Texas where we live, that a lot of people really don't like to be told what to do when it comes to injecting something in their body. So they're pretty anti-mandate in that respect. But it's interesting, different parts of the world react differently. I met a lady who was from Mongolia, and she said, oh, in Mongolia, they just say, line up, get the shot. Here, you're all big babies. People cry when they say, take the vaccine. So it's a different mentality in different parts of the world. Yeah. We don't know what it's like in your part of the world, but certainly people around here don't like to be told what to do. And it's just, we've never really seen it quite like this before. Even when the polio vaccine was being given in the early 50s, people lined up, everybody got it, but everybody wanted it. There was no mandate, everybody just accepted it without a mandate. And certainly it did get rid of polio. So this is a different story, and it's maybe it's just a foreshadow of what is to come, and the world is being prepared for the end time.
Well, it's hard for governments to let go of power once they've gotten it for one thing or another, even once that emergency has ended, as hopefully this emergency will end soon, God willing. But we've seen a lot of times how it is hard for governments to then say, okay, we're done, we don't need this power anymore. All right, so a story that is ongoing and has been in the news all throughout 2021, but is more in focus right now, is about the war between Russia, Ukraine, and these breakaway parts of the Ukraine ever since the coup in Ukraine that put in a new government, and the parts that were pro-Russia tried to break away, and there's been a war there ever since. People are talking now about Ukraine becoming part of NATO, which seems fairly imprudent, and talking about how that could lead to a war with Russia. Do you think there are people who would like a war with Russia, or is this just hype, to sell news stories?
Well, I can certainly understand from the Russian point of view that they're concerned that NATO, which they consider U.S. forces, would be right at their border. Now, I thought with the end of communism in the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, that we're supposed to be friends with Russia. I don't understand why Russia would be afraid of America, or America with Russia. Why is that? Because that seems to be the conflict, that if NATO forces enter the Ukraine, Russia's not going to be happy about that, and therefore they're putting all these troops, up to 100,000 or more, right on the Ukrainian border to kind of send the signal, don't bring NATO. And why isn't Russia and the United States, why aren't relations between the two countries better, do you think, after the fall of the Soviet Union?
Well, it seems like for a while there was some real hope there, but Russia wanted to keep its independence, and the way that Western companies and banks kind of exploited Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, I think led to a lot to Russians thinking, well, maybe we don't want to be part of the West. And they do have, just historically, it seems, a mindset of controlling these countries on their borders. And if you're in a country like Ukraine or the Baltic states, you're going to be pretty concerned about what Russia might be, how Russia might be thinking about you. So I think a lot of these countries have moved towards NATO, and then that makes Russia feel, therefore, more insecure.
Yeah, after 50 or 60 years of the Cold War, it's kind of hard to break out of that mentality. Yeah. I would like to read from Matthew chapter 24. These are the words of Jesus. He's talking about the end times. This is Matthew chapter 24, verses 6, 7, and 8. You shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. So I think one element in the situation in the Ukraine or the pulling out of Afghanistan or possible wars and rumors of wars in the world, one thing to remember is that the United States of America has a very large defense budget. Now, some people call that a war budget, but let's just call it a defense budget. Just for the record, the United States defense budget or war budget for 2021, this year, is $753.5 billion. Just to compare it to China's defense budget is $178 billion, and Russia's is $41.6 billion. In fact, the 11 countries with the biggest defense budgets in the world, the 11 countries underneath the United States, don't even equal the United States defense budget. I don't know if you remember, Peter, there's an old term called war, boom, bust. But that's been happening in the United States for almost 200 years. There's a war, then there's an economic boom, and then there's a bust. Now, we have inflation in the United States, crazy inflation, and in other parts of the world too right now. Is this the bust after the war? We got out of Afghanistan. So maybe, getting back to your question about the Ukraine, maybe since the United States economy is so dependent on this defense budget, it's a big part, the United States defense budget being about 5% of the U.S. economy, it's important that maybe there's a war going on someplace to keep that industry going.
Sure.
And wouldn't the Ukraine be a kind of...
Well, a war, or the idea of a war, something to keep that spending going. And it's interesting, what really put an end to the Great Depression was the Second World War, and this war economy hasn't really ended ever since then. It's always been kept going for one thing or another.
The Korean, the Vietnam.
Yeah, sure. War on terror.
That's right.
You name it.
The Afghan War was the longest war in U.S. history.
Yeah.
20 years.
Now people are looking to space. People are always trying to keep the spending going, keep this economy going. And it is pretty dangerous, because war isn't a game. It's a very serious and devastating thing, and even when there isn't conflict between big countries, well, the way the United States does its strategy and its war spending often leads to conflicts in smaller countries. With the U.S.'s allies, as we see, as you mentioned, in Afghanistan, a 20-year war there between one side backed by the United States and this rebel group. And we see it happen in a number of countries. Now, we did see when the former Soviet Republic of Georgia ended up in a conflict with Russia, thankfully the United States did not get involved. A lot of people thought that was a very dangerous flashpoint. Turned out that no, people acted more prudently, and there was a war there, but it was a limited war, and the United States did not get pulled in. So I think we can hope that the people in power in the U.S. and in Russia and in Ukraine are wise enough to know that a war is in nobody's interests. And thankfully, along with this buildup of troops that you talked about, there is a lot of emphasis on diplomacy. Russia has put out a list of things that they want to talk to the U.S. about. The United States has agreed to talk to Russia about that list of concerns. So I think there is hope that this can all be de-escalated.
And certainly we've heard many people think that the United States is supposed to be the policeman of the world, or shouldn't be the policeman of the world. And we certainly don't think the United States should be the policeman of the world and let people work their own problems out. Since we're talking about war, we had a big conflict that took place in May of 2021 between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And just to remind our viewers, in that war, that conflict, which we would call was a mini war, according to the UN and Human Rights Watch, they reported that 260 Palestinians had been killed in that conflict, 129 civilians, including 66 children and 40 women. And 1,900 Palestinians were injured. By contrast, 13 Israelis were killed, including 2 children, and 200 Israelis were injured. It seemed to be a conflict, a mini war that was very imbalanced in a sense, and it was triggered by what some people would think was a minor event that took place at the Temple Mount, cutting the speakers off during the Islamic hour of prayer. And there were a few other incidents that caused the situation to flare up. Do you think there's a possibility of more flare-ups between the Palestinians and the Israelis? It's an important part of the world, and especially considering end-time events that are going to unfold in that part of the world.
I think there's always a possibility of flare-ups, as long as we have people who have the idea that that war is a solution, that violence makes things right, that if you're afraid of someone, then you act violently towards them. Unfortunately, we see Israel pursuing a strategy that is not conducive to long-term stability. Saudi Arabia, too, coincidentally, they're another country in that region that has been pretty aggressive to its neighbor Yemen this past year. But back to Israel, they had this conflict with the Palestinian territories, and they've also been launching strikes on Syria nonstop for the past several years, including during this year that we're in right now. So, anything, once one of these conflicts finally ends, it's going to take decades to actually heal those wounds and come to peace and stability. So, they're not just creating instability now. Any actions done now are creating instability for the rest of this generation and the next one too.
I think it's an interesting point of view here in the United States. The majority of Americans that you speak with are very pro-Israeli and very anti-Palestinian. The Palestinians are the bad guys. The Israelis are the good guys. The Israelis, and they read the same Bible as Christians, and maybe that's the common ground, except for the New Testament. The Palestinians, of course, are Muslims, the majority of them, and they claim to have the same father. Abraham is our father of their faith, just like it is for the Jews, just like it is for Christians. Why do you think American public opinion is oh so pro-Israeli? Why is public opinion so anti-Palestinian? The Palestinians certainly have been pushed into a corner, especially if you look at the way the peace agreements were supposed to be played out in 1947 and 1948. Why today do most Americans think the Palestinians are the bad guys?
I think you'd have to look at the media. It's very much supportive of military action, very much supportive of anyone perceived to be an ally of the United States is highly favored in the media, whether that is Ukraine versus Russia, Israel versus the Gaza, or any of these situations. The media will give that a lot of attention and will put out, of course, a very biased story to the public, and in turn that ends up leading to more people voting for politicians who favor more military spending, more military aid. It's kind of a cycle there that keeps, like we just talked about, this war economy going. I talked to Brian Moon a few times on our podcast, and he talks about the importance of sowing seeds in life. The different chapters we talked about, Isaiah 55, 2 Peter chapter 1, and he talks about the importance of putting out deeds into the world that put out life, that bring goodness, that bring blessing. And I think that applies to individuals and to countries. Countries need to start sowing the kind of seeds that they want to reap in their future. And I think if you're a supporter of Israel, and if you're an Israeli, absolutely, you want to have a future of peace and stability for your country and the people around you. And there's no time like the present to start building that future.
And if you're watching this and you wonder whether we are pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, yes, we are pro-Israeli, but guess what? We are also pro-Palestinian, because we know that most of the Jews in Israel do not know our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and most of the Palestinians also do not know our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So our prayers are for both peoples, the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the only real way they can find true peace is with the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. And there's been a pretty big story coming out of India just about a week ago. Would you explain what happened? And some of our viewers may not be aware of what happened in the agricultural industry of India, but it's really a big deal.
Yeah, so
I
I think
for almost a quarter population of the earth who live there.
Exactly. India is a very important country and is only going to grow in importance, I think, as time goes on. And so there were these farm bills passed late last year, kind of pulling back government involvement in price supports and different things that different government involvement in the farming sector, kind of exposing the Indian agricultural markets to more to global markets. And for the most part, the farmers and the farmer unions did not like those reforms. They thought they were just too open-ended, not well enough crafted, and they protested. They protested quite heavily for months. They shut down parts of the country. It was a pretty big deal that happened there. And lo and behold, I think it was at the end of November of this year where the ruling party kind of gave up on those reforms and said, well, we're not going to go ahead with these. So it was pretty interesting to see.
So that's in favor of the small farmer, right? These are
sure. Now there were farmers on both sides of this, but it seemed like the majority opinion was that no, India's farmers wanted to don't want to have a more liberalized open market. They want to have more in the way of government support and these different measures that are already in place to help people stay on the land and help people stay prosperous in these rural areas. And in my opinion, it's important that we have a functioning rural area in all parts of the world where people who know how to live on the land and work the land can do so and have a prosperous and sustainable future for themselves and their children, as opposed to everyone coming into cities and cities growing and growing and growing, and the poverty and all that comes with that.
Yes. Another important story that has been going on for the past several months, and certainly a lot of people in the United States are looking at it, and that is a decision in the Supreme Court as they discuss the very important issue of women's rights in relation to abortion, whether abortion is legal or illegal. Ever since 1973, when the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision came down legalizing abortion in the United States, it certainly has been a controversial issue, very much so in the last few years. So now the Supreme Court has a majority of conservative justices on the 9-judge panel. And it was interesting in the last month or two that this controversial pro-life bill law that was enacted in the state of Texas was not knocked down by the Supreme Court. And even though the Supreme Court hasn't actually come out and made any decisions on whether or not abortion should remain legal in the United States or not, it is an issue that is being talked about and discussed and is a very hot topic in the United States right now. About half the country being anti-abortion and half the country being pro-abortion. And I would like to just throw out this one verse from the Bible, which I brought to the table here, and that is Psalm 127, verse 3. It says, "Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward." So we talk about the rights of women, but I think the controversy is over whether an unborn baby has rights also. And we're just bringing it to the table here. It's a very important issue. And our prayers are that the Lord will have his way in the decisions that are being made probably in the year to come in relation to abortion.
Well, I know a lot of the people who are in favor of these anti-abortion laws are mostly going to be Christians. And so this is very much, I think, something that Christians have their minds on in the United States. And of course, if there's something that is going wrong in the world, and in any country, there's going to be a lot of things that are legal that are not right. And thankfully, there's always something that we can do about that.
It's interesting when you look at some other countries. We're talking about India and the farming laws. Abortion is against the law in India, except for certain circumstances like rape and different situations where a woman could have a baby aborted. I, for one, am very, very happy that my mother didn't decide to abort me, or we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation right now. I don't know how you feel about that, but I'll bet you you're glad your mom didn't have you aborted either.
So we talked about this a little bit already, but the Afghanistan war, and of course that, at least the United States involvement in that, came to a very abrupt and final, hopefully, end this year. That was pretty significant, I think, that this new president comes in and within a few months he had pulled out, took all the political flack that you could imagine, and then it's over.
That's right. And there might be some things about different presidents that we like or don't like, but we have to hand it to Biden for doing that. And yes, he did get a lot of political flack, both from his own party and the other party, but we're out of Afghanistan. The sad story right now in Afghanistan is it's being hit by sanctions. Who's putting the sanctions, which is stopping a lot of food, medical supplies, and other supplies that they need to build up the country? Who's putting the sanctions on Afghanistan?
Right. So, to his credit, he, Biden pulled the U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, and to his discredit, almost immediately put some pretty tough sanctions on that country because now they have a government that the United States does not approve of. So, and that's leading to some real suffering. These sanctions tend to go on countries that are already suffering.
Starvation, especially among the small children, if you look at the stats.
You look at all these countries around the world that are under sanctions, they tend to be poor countries already, countries that are suffering from some tough economic or security situation, and then the sanctions come on, and they have a real effect, and these effects are devastating.
Yeah, so let us remember to pray for the poor people in Afghanistan. You might not like their government, but the masses that live there, that they are able to get their food and medical supplies that they need. And we can pray that in some way, shape, or form, that the government of the Taliban will open its doors to Christian missionaries, even if they just go in there to help with supplies and medical and food supplies, that somehow the door opens that we can bring them the gospel of Jesus Christ. But in whatever the case is, we'd like to hear some comments from you all. Again, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, we'd like to invite you to do that right now. Thanks for watching all of the different things that we put up over the past year. We sure hope you join us for 2022. We've got a lot of things lined up. We're going to be doing a little segment about that in the next few days, so stay tuned. And God bless you. Have a happy new year, and see you next time.